Welcome to the book of Joshua, part 2, Entering the Promised Land. Let's talk about the battles in Joshua. There are many of them and very descriptive. We'll start out with this slide about the battle narratives. In the Old Testament world, we have to remember that land was the fundamental good. It was the basis of life, joy, and fulfillment. The land was the allocation which most other forms of social existence were shaped to serve. To be religious today is to emphasize spirituality over material. Such a distinction was foreign to the Old Testament world. And remember, we talked about this in the past, how Israel and people in ancient times did not see separation between God and daily life. It was all in one. And their whole life was wrapped in, and the gods were very active in their lives. There was then no clearer knowledge of God than that God was the one who gave to Israelites their land. And to keep their land, they must heed the law laid down by God, including stipulations governing material goods. Land, law, and people. These are the components of historical existence in ancient Canaan or Palestine that pointed to the one known as Yahweh, the Lord of all. So now Joshua is established as the divinely appointed leader. The covenant practices are initiated in this new land. All the males are circumcised, and the Passover feast is celebrated. And this is after they have crossed the Jordan, and they're camped at a place called Gilgal. So this is important because the rituals symbolize that the people are God's covenant people. They are in good standing with the Abrahamic covenant and the Sinai covenant established under Moses. So the importance of Gilgal. Once the territories are divided up, the campsite of Gilgal ends up being in an allotment to Benjamin. So call it the Benjamin Shrine at Gilgal plays a significant role as early as the prophetic sources for the history of King David. First of all, upon crossing the Jordan River, which was separated, once the priests led the ark into the center of the river, if you recall that story. So then 12 men, one from each tribe, were instructed to carry a stone from the center of the river and place them together to create a stone cairn in memorial of the crossing of the river. And this is in Joshua chapter 4. So this then became the base camp for Israel. It's where the people stayed before they were allotted their land. It is at this place that the circumcision took place of this generation being led from the desert into the promised land. And the first Passover is celebrated there. And the importance of this Passover is that it is now they are in the land and there is no longer manna being provided for the people. And so from here on out, they are instructed to live off the fruit of the land and the produce of the land. And it's also important in the future because the prophet Samuel, or he's kind of a prophet priest, anoints Saul to be the first king at the site of Gilgal. And then later he brings a young David back to Gilgal and anoints David to be a king to replace Saul. So we're getting ready, preparations, ready, set, and go. According to chapter 6 through 12, Israel takes possession of the land through a series of violent battles. The narrative tells of conquest, but it's really a story of God leading the people into success versus the military might of the people. Because remember that warrior angel of the Lord back in chapter 5? Well, Yahweh would be the ultimate leader in the battles, not Joshua. This is when Joshua had his vision of the messenger from God. He said he was a warrior for God. In preparation for the conquest, Joshua sends 2 spies to Jericho to scout out the city. In exchange for hiding and helping the spies escape, Rahab negotiates a guarantee of safety for her family. And the story of Jericho starts out with these spies seeking information from Rahab, and the story ends and comes full circle to the spies seeking out the family of Rahab to save them from the Hiram. We'll talk about what a Hiram is in a little bit. So this is really a literary device that we call a cyclical story, bringing the story fully to completion, starting and ending with the same idea. So in this case, the idea of Rahab, or topic of Rahab. The story of Rahab and the spies is also an example of juxtaposition. So I'm referring back now to those historical books that the first lesson we started this unit with, where it talks about different literary devices within the historical books. And so one of those was putting something into a story that didn't seem like it belongs there, but later becomes important. So in this juxtaposition, it's important because in later genealogies, we see that Rahab is the ancestor of David, and therefore an ancestor of Jesus. And the action of aiding the spies is really just probably a story to clean up her personal history and make it more acceptable that she actually was included in the genealogy for Jesus. And a couple of pictures. Here's a picture of her covering the spies and hiding them on the roof. And a picture of a woman in ancient times who may represent someone like Rahab, who is kind of to be not seen in daylight because of her reputation. So she's kind of sneaking around at night. So the stories of Jericho and Gilgal play a central role in this story because Achan, one of the men who goes to war with Joshua, he hides some of the spoils from Jericho in his camp in Gilgal. He hides them in the earth under his tent. And they go to war against the city of Ai. And at the first attempt, they fail. So then they have to go back and figure out why they failed. And Joshua calls people tribe by tribe, and then family by family, and head of household to find out who has done something inappropriate that caused them to fail. And the family of Achan is the one who comes up. So the story of Ai mirrors the story of Jericho in both that they highlight an individual person, in this case, Rahab, and in another case, Achan. And the two individuals are then contrasted so that Rahab becomes a loyal, true Israelite to the cause, and Achan is disloyal to this same cause of Israel. And the two stories are linked through the Hiram at Jericho. And a Hiram is the dedication of every living thing and all material goods to Yahweh. So what that means is when God instructed them to destroy everything that was living, animals, people, including women and children, and any products such as grains and foods. They were to destroy everything. Except for Rahab, Rahab was spared because of her promise, the promise to her family. But so they're not to bring anything back to their camp. They are only to bring back metals, which are not easily destroyed. So if there's any metals or jewels, such as gold or silver and so on, they would be brought back and they would be dedicated to God and put in the royal temple, which in this case we don't have yet, but they're set aside for God. So Rahab is spared from the application of this dedication called herem, but Achan is snared for violating it. In other words, the loyal Canaanite is included and the disloyal Israelite is excluded. So the point of the story here is that Israel is not to go to war for plunder and greed. Yahweh leads the battle and Yahweh gets the plunder. All valuable metal and jewels are dedicated to him and are given to the house of the Lord. And again, Rahab's family is spared from the herem, but Achan's family is not. In fact, he and his whole family are taken outside the camp and stoned to death. So after the battle at Jericho and everything is razed to the ground, Joshua makes this curse on the area. And so at this time, Joshua invoked this curse. May the curse of the Lord fall on anyone who tries to rebuild the town of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation. All the cost of his youngest son, or at the cost of his youngest son, he will set up its gates. So in the future, Jericho was rebuilt during the days of King Ahab, along with Josiah. Long before Josiah, Hiel rebuilt Jericho, and in fulfillment of Joshua's curse, it did cost him his two sons. And this is reported in 1 Kings chapter 16. And then the curse was in chapter 6 of Joshua. And it says in 1 Kings, it was during the reign of Ahab that Hiel, a man from Bethel, rebuilt Jericho. And when he laid its foundations, it cost him the life of his oldest son, Abiram. And when he completed it and set up its gates, it cost him the life of his youngest son, Segeb. This all happened according to the message from the Lord concerning Jericho, spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. Now, it doesn't tell us how or why the sons lost their lives. So we just have to, again, read between the lines and let it go at that, because we're not sure whether they were sacrificed, which was being done at that time under King Ahab, because he was one of the most corrupt kings of Israel, or whether it was accidental or illness. We will never know. And then moving on to this group of people called the Gibeonites, who form a deception and come to Joshua. So they send a group of messengers to Joshua asking for help. And when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to deception to save themselves. They sent ambassadors to Joshua, loading their donkeys with weathered saddlebags and old patched wineskins. They put on worn out, patched sandals and ragged clothes. And the bread they took with them was dry and moldy. When they arrived at the camp of Israel at Gilgal, they told Joshua and the men of Israel, "We have come from a distant land to ask you to make a peace treaty with us." So they're being deceptive. They dressed up as though they had come from a faraway place. So the Israelites examined their food and they did not consult the Lord. Then Joshua made a peace treaty with them and guaranteed their safety. And the leaders of the community ratified their agreement with a binding oath. So remember this law of Harem, where they are to go into any city that they battle against and destroy everything. So this law of Harem will not apply to the Gibeonites. So they're pretty savvy in negotiating this contract for peace. So the Gibeonites knew of the law of Harem and were using this ruse to protect themselves. And even in the time of David, much later, the position of the Gibeonites due to this story was known, and David protected the Gibeonites from the wrath of King Saul, who King Saul at one time was determined to destroy them, and David protected them because of this particular peace treaty that had been negotiated hundreds of years before. And you can read about that in the second book of Samuel, chapter 21, verse 2. And then we have another story involving the Gibeonites, where they are being attacked by some 5 kings who have joined together in a group in order to, or an alliance in order to fight against Israel. And so the Gibeonites send a plea to Joshua for help during the campaign of the southern cities. So beginning in chapter 10, verse 9, we read the story of how the battle against 5 kings turns into a victory and how nature played a role in this victory. And it says, Joshua traveled all night from Gilgal and took the Amorite armies by surprise. So Amorite is what this confederation and groups of people were called, who have joined together and made this alliance against Israel. The Lord threw them into a panic, and the Israelites slaughtered great numbers of them at Gibeon. And then the Israelites chased the army along the road to Beth Horon, killing them all along the way, Azekah and Makkedah. And as the Amorites retreated down the road from Beth Horon, the Lord destroyed them with a terrible hailstorm from heaven that continued until they reached Azekah. In some versions of this text, it says that stones fell from heaven. The hail killed more of the enemy than the Israelites killed with the sword. On the day the Lord gave the Israelites victory over the Amorites, Joshua prayed to the Lord in front of the people of Israel, and he said, "Let the sun stand still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Aijalon." So the sun stood still and the moon stayed in place until the nation of Israel had defeated its enemy. Is this event not recorded in the book of Jashar? The sun stayed in the middle of the sky and it did not set as on a normal day. And there was never been a day like this one before or since when the Lord answered such a prayer. Surely the Lord fought for Israel that day. And then Joshua and the Israelite army returned to their camp at Gilgal. So what happened here? First of all, we have a reference to an ancient source that would have been used by the scribes called the Book of Jashar. And we know that the scribes who wrote these stories down did have references and materials that aren't to be found today, but they're making a reference to this event that apparently was recorded in another book. But what really happened, we don't know, but we might think about things like it could have been an eclipse. It could just be a nice story. You just have to, again, take it as the reading and what does it mean? God was fighting for them and God answered their prayer, and then they defeated their enemies, whether with the use of some natural forces, nature. So these two narratives are explained as struggles first against the highland opponents called the Amorites when they're joined together in the south. So the highlands are actually geographically in the southern part of Israel. And the lowland opponents who are in the north, who use chariots and are joined by allies from all over Canaan. So the northern area is the lowlands. So think like the Nile in Egypt. The lowlands are on the northern part of the country and the highlands are in the southern part of the country. The same here in Israel, geographically. So the northern and southern campaigns are construed as defensive actions against the offensive alliances. The initiative for battle comes not from Joshua, but from the other kings who unite against him. So we've got this idea that it's a campaign where Joshua leads his forces in and just takes a big swath through the country and conquers everything. But yet we have these other stories from a different point of view where different groups rise up, and in order to defend themselves, Joshua leads his army into the battle to defend them. So it's from two different points of view within the same book. So remember Hiram. So in chapter 10, verse 40, it says, so Joshua conquered the whole region, the kings and the people of the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes. He completely destroyed everyone in the land, leaving no survivors, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua slaughtered them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, and from the region around the town of Goshen up to Gibeon. Joshua conquered all these kings in their land in a single campaign, for the Lord, the God of Israel, was fighting for his people. And then Joshua and the Israelite army returned to their camp at Gilgal. But yet, as we have been reading, it came in separate stages, not necessarily in one giant campaign. So here is a bit of a summary in verses 40 through 42. It describes the defeat of multiple kings. So Joshua took control of the entire land, just as the Lord had instructed Moses. He gave it to the people of Israel as their special possession, dividing the land among the tribes, so the land finally had rest from war. So in doing all of this, Joshua is really fulfilling the work that had originally been assigned to Moses to bring the people into the promised land. And Joshua fulfills that duty. So geographically, we look at this area. Use your imagination. This is just trying to show how hilly it is. So Moab, where they're camped just across Jordan, the Jordan where they had been camped in Moab would be about over here. And then they crossed Jordan down below the Dead Sea. And so they're down here. So Gilgal is down in this area. So this is the highlands, and this is the southern part. So in the southern part, we have the higher areas of land. And as it goes further north, we have lower land features. So this is the area that they are traveling. So you kind of see this road around through here. Here's Beersheba, we've seen that. Here's Gaza, and Ashkelon and Ashdod. These are things that we've heard mentioned as we've read through. Of course, Tel Aviv is a modern site, and Haifa. So let's go to the next map, which is a view from above, kind of a bird's eye view when you look down, and you can definitely see the fault line that follows through here. And you can see here, it's really tiny, but you can see that this is the area that was Moab over here. It says Moab right here. So these highlands are the highlands and plains of Moab. Here is the Negev, which is the kind of highlands with the wadis, the places where the water runs down from the mountains towards the sea. And this is the area, remember, where Abraham camped for a long period of time before they went into Egypt. And so you can just see that it is very hilly, but the higher and denser hills are down in the south and the lower ones are up above. And just to give you an idea of how tall these areas are, compare a little bit to Napa Valley. So Mount Hermon is the tallest place in Israel. So it's 9,000 feet. And second then, so it's quite a drop from that to the second highest is almost 4,000 feet. And then we have another about 3,500 feet. So I'm just rounding these numbers off. But compare that to Napa Valley. We have the Micamus Mountains around Napa Valley. So really it's like this. They surround the mountain, surround the valley. And they're more or less average around 4,300 feet, with Cobb Mountain being the tallest. And Cobb Mountain is 4,700 feet, so it's kind of comparable to Har Meron in northern part of Israel. And Mount St. Helena is 4,300 feet. And yes, Napa Valley does have a Mount Hood. It's not Mount Hood, Oregon, it's Mount Hood in Napa Valley. It's 2,700 feet. And so it's kind of like, if you can use your imagination, it's very much similar to looking through Napa from north to south. And so we have kind of a comparison there as far as the geography goes. All right, let's take a look at what our lady professor has to say today.
And then we have that very famous story of Jericho. When archaeologists engage in their investigation, what they look at is something called a tell. It's an artificial mound created by successive layers of cities that are built and then fall into ruin, and then you build another city on top of that and another city on top of that. And the archaeologist looks at this tell, this artificial mound, as if it's a layer cake. And you can slice through and you can find community destruction layer, different community destruction layer. And people have done this with the tell at Jericho. And what has archaeological investigation yielded? We've got inhabitants at Jericho in the Chalcolithic period, 4000 BCE. This place is already inhabited, and it's inhabited through the Middle Bronze Age. The problem is when we get up to the beginning of the Iron Age, which is when Joshua is starting, that's the one time when there seems to be no evidence of inhabitation. There seemed to be no evidence of inhabitation at all. Now, granted, the tell has suffered severe erosion. Perhaps the evidence that was there has been washed away or blown away, but it remains problematic. Even the story of Jericho remains problematic because this is where we meet Rahab the prostitute. Joshua and company outside the land send in spies to scout out Canaan, to scout out the city. And the first thing these spies do is they land in Rahab's house, and Rahab is running a brothel. She is a prostitute. Now, one can raise lots of questions as to why those spies went to a brothel first thing when they got into Canaan. And the easier explanations are that's where you could get information about city defenses, or that's where you could hide out. Nobody would much pay attention. And there are other reasons that we won't go into. But what happens is when they get into Rahab's house, Rahab has to hide them. And then word comes to the king of Jericho, Rahab is hiding spies. What happens? Rahab agrees to protect the spies as long as the Israelites, when they attack Jericho, preserve her and her family. And she actually will hang a red cord out of her window so that the Israelites during the conquest will know where she is. And then Rahab says to the king of Jericho, well, we understand who these Israelites are. We know that God is on their side. We know that God will force everyone to yield to them. Rahab, the Gentile, the prostitute, the Canaanite, recites Israel's salvation history, recites the mighty deeds of God, which is one of those nice ironies, because taking booty from these cities actually wind up being some of the Hebrews, and they wind up paying for it. This may be an etiology, by the way, to explain why there are Canaanites yet in the land, even though Joshua and Moses before him were commanded, wipe out the Canaanites before you. The Canaanites are still there. Rahab is somebody who it seems deserves to be there. There are several other etiologies in the text. There's a lovely one in Joshua 10 that describes why there are unusually large stones blocking the entrance to a cave, and it turns out, according to Joshua, that's where 5 kings of the land hid. I also like this story because for Joshua to conquer this land, he prays to God, and God causes the sun to stand still. That's where we get the idea that we have a geocentric rather than heliocentric universe. But it suggests to me, knowing something about modern physics and modern astronomy, that this is not an historical record, but rather a bit of folklore, folktale, replayed back into the time of the conquest. And finally, arguing against the full historicity of all this material is the beginning of the book of Judges, to which we will turn in the next lecture. Judges chapter 1 provides us a list of negative possessions, cities the Israelites did not conquer: Bethshan, Dor, Gezer, Akko, Sidon, major cities. The modern analogy would be someone, I won't suggest whom, conquered the United States, but among the cities still left standing, New York, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, Atlanta. It's not that much of a conquering effort if the major cities are still left standing. So because there remain archaeological problems here, both in terms of textual evidence in the book of Joshua and in terms of evidence on the ground, what people can dig up, other models for how the Israelites got into Canaan have been proposed. The most famous of these alternatives is known as the immigration model. And this is the idea that the various tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel, came over the desert and gradually entered the land, settling first in the sparsely populated hill countries and then only gradually moving down into the plains, so that the original entry of the Israelites into the land was more of a peaceful one than a warlike one. And it's only when they began to outgrow the land where they originally settled that some battles began. You can actually find some hints of this if you read the biblical tradition again carefully. For example, why are there 12 tribes divvied up among Jacob's wives? 6 Leah tribes, the Rachel tribes, and tribes associated with Rachel and Leah's maids, Bilhah and Zilpah, who wind up being Jacob's concubines. Perhaps it worked this way. Perhaps the 6 Leah tribes and the 4 concubine tribes came in first, and then the Rachel tribes arrived later with Yahwism. And then the communities begin to split up. We already know from Joshua and then Judges that certain tribes lose their land very quickly. The tribe of Reuben, for example, loses its land. But what do we have in Genesis? We have Jacob cursing Reuben for sleeping with Bilhah. And what's his curse? He's going to leave his land. Lose his land. Joshua plays it out. Simeon and Levi lose their land very, very quickly. Genesis 34 has Jacob curse Simeon and Levi for making him odious in the land because they attacked the city of Shechem and killed all the men. So what we may have with Genesis are foreshadowing etiologies for what actually happened to the individual tribes when they got into the land. My favorite example of this is when you go to the specific tribes and look at their names and look at their backgrounds, you can actually find suggestions that they were maybe even residents of Canaan to begin with, and if not, came over separately. Here are a couple of examples. According to Genesis 49, speaking of Issachar, one of the tribes, he saw that his resting place was good and that the land was pleasant, so he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a slave at forced labor, corvée. Now, it's possible that Issachar gained its tribal land by serving for it, by becoming enslaved, and then eventually throwing off the yoke of the enslaver. The tribe's name Issachar can actually mean a worker for wages, but we do have possible background for this. According to the Amarna letters, text preserved in Egypt, we have a reference to the area where Issachar settled around Mount Tabor. And we're told that the king there, the king of Megiddo, the major city, forced people from Mount Tabor and Shunem to act as slave porters. So perhaps Issachar's entry is backed up by the Amarna letters. Here's an even better one. These are the strange journeys of the tribe of Dan. Joshua chapter 19 connects Dan with Philistine settlements on the Mediterranean. Quite possible. But look at some of the other statements regarding Dan. The Song of Deborah, one of the oldest pieces of biblical literature we have in Judges chapter 5, says of the tribe of Dan, "Why did you linger by the ships?" Which is a very odd question to ask a group of people who ostensibly just came over the desert. Suddenly these are shipbuilders, they're maritime people? Odd. Genesis 49:16, Jacob's blessings to his sons reads, "Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel." Which is an odd statement unless Dan was not one of the tribes of Israel to begin with. Perhaps they're not originally connected with this covenant community. Perhaps they're indigenous to Canaan. Perhaps they're part of that Mediterranean group like the Philistines who came over. Judges chapter 18 asserts that the Danites, the members of the tribe of Dan, were seeking for an inheritance to settle because until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them, as if they came late and they lost out on the initial land grant. And finally, and perhaps most tellingly, we have external evidence of a group of sea peoples, that is, population groups that entered Canaan from the Mediterranean, who are called variously the Denyen, the Danoi, and the Danuna. And my suspicion is that the tribe of Dan is not related to Jacob, related to Israel from Genesis. What we have with Dan is a group of people that made common cause with the Israelites very, very early on, and ultimately were accepted into that tribal group. Other tribes may also fall into this category because the names of some of the other tribes suggest Canaanite origins. The tribe of Asher could be from Assur, the Assyrian god, or even Asherah, the Canaanite mother goddess. Gad, a tribe, is also the name of a Canaanite god, and Zebulun, yet another tribe, which means of the princes, is an epithet for the Canaanite god Baal. Odd names for Israelite tribes to be having, but entirely appropriate names for part of the indigenous population of Canaan who made common cause with the Israelites. So here we have perhaps some evidence of a gradual penetration, but also some evidence of yet a third model. Perhaps some people indigenous to Canaan rose up against their overlords, rejected city-state government, and then under the aegis of Yahwism, formed common cause with some of the tribes who came in from the wilderness. What we have in the Bible is a cleaned up version of probably what was an exceptionally complex ancient history. In terms of this complexity, let's go back to Joshua 24, that covenant ceremony at Shechem, which we've already talked about. Here we get some hints of different tribes with different historical memories. In Joshua's recitation of the history to the people, this is part of that covenant model, the historical prologue. Joshua mentions the Exodus. He mentions the wilderness experience. He mentions Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Esau, Moses, and Aaron. He leaves out the reference to Mount Sinai, the Sinaitic covenant, which is a very odd thing for him to be leaving out at a covenant renewal ceremony. One would have thought that would have been the high point of the wilderness journey. Why leave it out? Some biblical scholars suggest that the Exodus from Egypt represents the memory of one group of people who eventually comprised Israel, and the Sinaitic experience represents the experience of another group. And yet other groups, other tribes, had different experiences, perhaps those indigenous to Canaan. And ultimately they all come together and they develop a group memory. And that should not be surprising as well, because we in America do the same thing. My ancestors did not come over on the Mayflower. I am from Massachusetts, but my family does not go back quite that far. But every year, when I was a child, and now my children celebrate Thanksgiving, and on Thanksgiving Day, we pretend, and I think we actually believe, that we too are pilgrims, we too landed on Plymouth Rock, and we too celebrate religious freedom, and we too eat turkey, right? In other words, Americans have developed a communal memory. We all came over on the Mayflower. We were all somehow involved in the process of gaining freedom from England. People in Tennessee are still fighting the Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, as my neighbors refer to it. Even if they're not indigenous to Tennessee, even if they're not from the South, they take on the collective memory of the region, of the country, and that may well have been what the ancient Israelites did. So where are we then? It's possible that there was some sort of conquest. I certainly wouldn't rule that out. And it's certainly possible that Joshua was responsible for some of it. But I also think the model based on immigration, gradual penetration by different people at different times, also makes a good deal of sense. And there's a part of me that's attracted to that third model. You might consider it an ancient version of the revolt of the proletariat, where some people rejected the city-state governance, rejected their marginalization, rejected the cults, the religion of the city-state, and left, thought there must be a better place somewhere else, and made common cause with some of these other people marginal to the city-states. How was this all eventually put together? The so-called conquest is therefore probably a composite story, some fictional based on ideology, some historical, but the history coded by folktale and legend, and we've already seen how literary convention causes people to change the way they tell history. The book of Joshua, therefore, conjoins history and folktale and explanations for ruins and perhaps all these different tribes from different places, and brings them all together. By the end of Joshua, the people have made common cause. They are united into one covenanted community. When we turn next to the book of Judges, we find out that this is really all fiction. The tribes have not united. They are at war not only with Canaanite city-states, they are at war with each other. They have not conquered the entire land. To the contrary, Canaanite city-states are oppressing them left and right. Disasters are occurring. The book of Judges shows us perhaps what might be a little more the case. The Israelites trying to get on their feet, and the Israelites here as well entering the Iron Age and finding the wonders of new technology with iron chariots and new forms of warfare and new enemies and new problems to face. That's the book of Judges, and that's the next lecture. Judges chapter 4.
All right. So I think that she makes some very valid points in her lecture. And I think that looking at it we have to know that this is a story that's been recorded for information and for talking to or writing to the people following the Babylonian exile to give them much hope. Okay, that they would be able to go back into their land. So they're reviewing a story from the past in order to give people more hope for the future. All right, so we're coming to the end of the lesson, and here's our verse for today. I was thinking that this is Earth Week. All week we've been celebrating Earth Week, and thinking about the fact that once they entered the land, they were told that now they would live off of the produce of the land. So Jeremiah, the prophet, refers to this and reminds them of it. I brought you into a plentiful land to eat its fruit and its good things. But when you entered, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. So what he's talking about is the time they spent in the land was for a good reason. It was their inheritance. But after living there for a long time, they fell away from the rules of Yahweh, the laws of God. And he calls that an abomination. So Chief Seattle, very famous for his wisdom, had this to say: humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to that web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things connect. And a prayer. Creator, forgive us for the ways we have harmed this web of life today and every day. Remind us that you created us to be careful stewards of your plentiful creation, of which we are bound together. Suggested reading for next week is Joshua chapters 13 through 21. So we're almost to the end. We're going to talk about the allotments of the land. And looking back at Genesis 49, when Jacob blesses his sons, and as she's recalled in her lecture, that some of those blessings have been fulfilled in the book of Joshua, or curses. And our final joke, which we must always have. I guess it's your point of view whether you like or dislike banjo music. And have a good week. We will return with another lesson on the book of Joshua to conclude it next week.